Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Samantha Politics. I'm delighted to be with you. I'm your host, Samantha Carlin, and this is your source for global politics with a feminist lens. I'm delighted, as usual, to have two unbelievably qualified guests waiting in the wings with more Ivy League degrees than I even know how to handle. And so I'm excited to bring them on to talk about the impact of Roe v. Wade, although the gravity of the issue is, of course, quite upsetting. If you like this episode, please share it. You can also become a subscriber at patreon.com/SamanthaPolitics1 if you want to support women's rights as well. So let's get down to business. What is going on? Well, our show before last, we talked about what would happen if Roe v. Wade was overturned. Now, I just want to tell you, Roe v. Wade has obviously been overturned. And I think that what we predicted is not even close to the horror that we're seeing today since the overturn of Roe v. Wade. We have ultimately seen chaos all over the country as some states ban the practice. We now have 8 states that have completely banned abortion, even in cases of rape and incest. A 10-year-old child can be raped or be raped by her brother and still will not be able to access abortion, even though her body is not ready to carry a pregnancy to term, and the likelihood that she may die is high. We're also seeing all of these places that are all of these people that are no longer able to get drugs that they need because they may be considered what's called abortophascists, which means they could potentially cause an abortion. So breaking news is that CVS just issued a memo to all of its pharmacies in states where abortion has been banned, telling them that they cannot fill certain drugs that are not meant for abortion, that are meant for lupus, as one example, without a diagnostic code from the doctor that proves that it's not going to be used for an abortion. So we're starting to see all of these places and hospitals and pharmacies protecting themselves because they know that the states are vicious and they are going to go after women. They're going to go after providers. They're going to go after families. They're going to go after Uber drivers. They're going to take women to abortion. And it's even for providing information about abortion for the clinics who have closed is not allowed, and they are scared to do that. We are now living in a climate of fear. And now all of these women who at one point would have been able to access abortions, and I would like to point out that abortion is healthcare, are no longer able to access them. So the states that have outlawed abortion are Alabama, Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Missouri, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. Fun fact, Wisconsin's law dates back from 1849, because that's the kind of law we should be going back to, is something from 1849, which does not allow abortions even in rape and incest. Even though an article in the Washington Post pointed out yesterday that in the founding fathers actually didn't think that abortion should be criminalized and it should be an issue. Now, the U.S. is going against a global trend, which the global trend has been towards liberalization of abortion. We've talked about in our last shows how Argentina legalized abortion, Ireland legalized abortion, Mexico decriminalized abortion. We've seen this, what's called a green wave in Latin America to legalize abortion. Chile, my sources say, are now enshrining the right to an abortion within their new constitution that is currently being written. So we are one of the only states, I think one of 4 states in the world that have actually regressed on abortion rights rather than moving forward, along with Poland, which has seen a dramatic rise in populism. And if there's any country we don't want to model ourselves after right now, it is Poland. On the other end, we've seen something interesting happen where some of the states that do allow abortion, such as France, have started to look at their laws and make them even more liberal or enshrine them in the nation's constitution because they're scared that populists like in the US will take over in that country and try to get rid of it. So they're trying to enshrine abortion rights in the constitution just in case the same thing happens as in the US, where we have a very far right president elected who nominates, it's a different system, but he was able to somehow overturn Roe v. Wade or overturn abortion rights within that country. We also saw everybody making a hullabaloo about the House passing the Women's Protection Act. And it was interesting. I was just on a show abroad and they talked about the Women's Health Protection Act. But the problem is the House already passed the Women's Health Protection Act. They passed it in September when the Texas law was passed. And guess what? It did absolutely nothing. I mean, it's exciting that it passed. However, it doesn't matter because the Senate will turn it down. So the House voting for something that passed doesn't actually have any impact on the lives of people today that are being affected. Let's see, what else? More than a dozen Democratic members of Congress were arrested by the Capitol Police this Tuesday, about 3 miles from where I stand, because they were sitting in the street in front of the Supreme Court in protest for abortion rights. I really wish that some of those people were able to have more sway in Congress to be able to reverse this horror that's happening. We've also seen the Biden administration, who has now told hospitals that if they get federal funding, which most of them do, they must provide life-saving care to women who are having life-threatening pregnancies. I'm not sure what's going to happen if we have women who self-induce abortions. I'm hoping that that also will be within the category of providing life-saving care. And Texas has now sued and said, no, not interested. We don't care about saving the lives of mothers. We just care about saving fetuses. We've also seen lots of women who are getting severe complications, and so they're not even being allowed to be treated until it's deemed life-threatening. So in order for doctors to treat them, they have to let them essentially bleed out until it's considering life-threatening enough to be able to operate on them. Another thing that we just saw that made the news was a 10-year-old who was raped and denied an abortion, and she had to go out of state to get one. Let's see. So I just want to point out that one researcher estimates that a quarter of those who would have sought and previously been able to get an abortion are instead going to give birth. They're 3 times more likely to live in poverty than those who were successful at getting abortion. They are more likely to end up unemployed, and people who can't obtain abortions are more likely to get debt, go bankrupt, or be evicted. Legal abortion in the past has also reduced the number of children who are living in poverty. If children grow up in poverty, they're more likely to end up in the criminal justice system, and their lifelong earnings and job potential are also affected. There's other research that saw that legalizing abortion actually reduced instances of child abuse and neglect, where on the other end, not having legal abortions actually increases the rates of infanticide, which is babies essentially being killed because they weren't able to be killed in utero. So I think we're actually going to see more actual living, breathing babies killed as a result of all these very conservative Catholics trying to save the fetus. So I would love to bring in our 2 guests right now who are both experts within these issues. So our first guest is Stephanie Schmidt, who you might remember from our show on Haiti because she's unbelievably diverse in terms of her knowledge base. She was the 2020 Democratic nominee for Congress in New Jersey's 4th Congressional District. She also served a U.S. Foreign Service officer, and she currently works as a foreign policy and human rights consultant, attorney, and advocate, advising NGOs, nonprofits, media, and congressional candidates on foreign policy, human rights, and abortion rights. She has a bachelor's from Yale, and she has a JD from the University of California at Berkeley. So let's bring in, and most importantly, in terms of this, she led the U.S.'s foreign policy program at the Center for Reproductive Rights. Welcome to the show, Steph. There we go. Now you're unmuted.
Thanks so much, Sam. Great to be with you.
Thank you so much for having us. And our second guest, you might notice her last name seems a little similar to mine because she is my sister. Molly Carlin is an assistant federal public defender in the District of Arizona, where she's going to tell us what the heck is happening because it's unclear if there's a ban, there's not a ban, who knows. She represents defendants charged with federal crimes who cannot afford an attorney. She practices primarily in the Federal Court of Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court. Prior to joining the Federal Public Defender's Office, Molly worked for big fancy law firms in New York and LA and for a federal appellate judge. She holds a BA from Yale and a JD from Columbia Law School. She also wants to point out that the views that she states here are her own and they're not representative of her office or of the federal government. Welcome to the show, Molly.
Thank you, Samantha. I'm honored to be here.
So can we just start with WTAF? Like how did this happen?
Well, it's been the stated goal of the Republican Party and on their platform for a number of decades. They have made appointing federal judges, particularly Supreme Court judges who wanted to overturn Roe v. Wade and get rid of abortion rights, a top priority. It is why many of the politicians who are initially anti-Trump ended up supporting Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election, because he released a list of judges, all culled from the Federal Society list, who were very clear that they were going to overturn Roe v. Wade if appointed. So to all those people who said they didn't know what Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett and Gorsuch were going to do, I'm looking at you, Senator Collins, you might have wanted to check their records and writings and past public statements, because this has always been the goal. And Molly, I know you know that, but then the only other thing I'll say is that a Supreme Court seat was stolen by the Republican Party when Justice Scalia passed away a year before the 2016 presidential election, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell refused to hold a confirmation hearing for now Attorney General Merrick Garland, who at the time was sitting on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. So that seat was stolen. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, and just a month and a half before the next presidential election, but Amy Coney Barrett was confirmed to that seat in a complete reversal of policy. And in the interim of those two appointments, we had Anthony Kennedy voluntarily step down for the appointment of Brett Kavanaugh. So here we are with a court whose stated purpose for being was to overturn Roe v. Wade. So it's not a surprise for anybody that's been following this issue or the federal court system or U.S. politics for quite some time.
Let's talk about how this is, I was talking to Molly before this, and she said to me, Samantha, this has unleashed chaos. And even the court, I don't think, understood what exactly they were doing and how much chaos they were unleashing. Molly, can you comment on that?
The case before the Supreme Court concerned Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health. It concerned a 15-week ban on abortion that Mississippi passed. Roe v. Wade from 1973 says that a woman must be able to obtain an abortion in a manner that doesn't unduly restrict her rights up until viability, which under current medical practice is about 23, 24 weeks. So the Mississippi law was flatly in violation of Roe versus Wade, and it was brought specifically because Mississippi, along with a number of other conservative states, anticipated that this Supreme Court might be willing to overturn Roe. What I found surprising was that the court didn't just rule on the case before it. That is usually the role of courts, not to render advisory opinions on issues that are not before them. The question here.
So I'm going to just stop for a second, just to be in legal speak. So it's not to render advisory opinions on issues that are not before them. So not to issue a broad type of ruling, but really just to make a ruling on the particular case. Is that correct for the audience?
Right. I mean, that's the basic idea. Some rulings are broader than others or necessarily have broader implications. But this court really, in a really radical departure from precedent and a really activist mode, decided they weren't just going to rule on whether the 15-week ban was constitutional. Now, they would have had to overturn Roe in a sense to do that, because they would have had to say the viability line set in Roe was wrong or is no longer valid. Instead, what they did is they went beyond that and said, we're overturning Roe completely, even in as to questions that are not before us, by basically stating that states can regulate pregnancy and abortions from fertilization, not even implantation, from fertilization. So that suddenly triggered a whole host of laws that were in place prior to Roe v. Wade, in some instances, decades or more than a century prior, and that states were unprepared to interpret or enact, and that may conflict with more recent laws that maybe pose some restrictions, but not complete bans or close to them.
And you know what's stunning, Molly, is that there are some justices on the court who wanted to go much further and have indicated they want to go much further. And if you look at Justice Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion, he signals that he thinks every decision grounded in this idea of substantive due process, what I think laymen would more understand as the right to privacy, should be revisited. And some of the cases that he specifically called out are the Griswold decision in 1965 that guaranteed married couples the right to contraceptives, the Obergefell decision, which guaranteed gay marriage, which is why we saw the House vote yesterday to shore up the right to marry the person who you love, regardless of race or sexual orientation, and then also other cases that have to do with LGBTQ human rights and just the general rights of people to have privacy within their bedrooms, within their lives and their families. And so, like, when you say activist court, when we were both in law school studying these cases, I don't think we could have ever envisioned a world where 6 justices who purport to be small c conservative and not striking down a half century of precedent would do something like this. And I think that was the political problem, Sam, that Democrats just
we couldn't fathom that this could actually happen.
That they would be so radical and so brazen and just so contradictory inherently to prior case law and statements.
So what's happened? Let's talk about what's happened since then. So since Roe was overturned, obviously I talked about the different states where it's banned. What the heck is going on? Like, what have we seen happen within the country?
Well, I'll say there are just numerous areas of life, people who are impacted, places that are impacted, and ways in which people are impacted that I don't think the Supreme Court anticipated, particularly because their decision lends the idea that, you know what, we can just settle the abortion issue once and for all. It's always been controversial. Now it's decided, we're washing our hands of it. Instead, it's unleashed the exact opposite. Because as you pointed out, Samantha, there are women who are being denied drugs to treat things that have nothing to do with abortion. We have concerns now about women, and there have been a few prosecutions even in light of Roe, but women potentially being prosecuted for miscarriages or drug use, or perhaps sushi will be on the list, or maybe an athlete is doing an athletic activity, skiing, or something that could be dangerous, deemed dangerous to a fetus, and maybe she could be prosecuted for that. I think we're also, or at least I hope, we're going to see people who otherwise don't engage with this issue begin to engage. For example, people in blue states, and I think might still be feeling, okay, well, at least it's not going to affect me, but it will, because there's going to be a flood of people, and there already is, especially from Texas, since Texas's law went into effect several months ago, flooding to neighboring states for abortions and having to now wait weeks. So that also means that local people who need abortions are now not going to be able to get the prompt care that they need.
Can I just stop you for 1 second, Molly, and then I want to go to Steph. Molly, are people really going to be prosecuted?
Yes. Yes, there have been over 1,000 cases in the past 15 or so years where, and this is, again, while Roe is still the law of the land, who have been prosecuted for potentially causing miscarriages through drug use or similar. this really makes me concerned that we're going to go toward, or we're very quickly moving toward the scene in The Handmaid's Tale where the pregnant handmaid is chained up so that she can't hurt herself or injure her forthcoming child. The police are now going to be able to intrude on our bodies and ask what's going on with our reproductive systems.
And this is the problem, is that the surveillance technology now exists in a way it didn't before to really monitor people. And so like, here are a few of the crazy things that we've seen in the past few weeks, like reported. We've seen a woman who was traveling from Australia to house sit in Canada be denied a transitory visa to transit through the US on her layover flight and return to Australia for violating our visa laws. But she's reported that all the questions that were asked of her by officers at the airport had to do with her loose fitting clothing. Was she pregnant? Why was she traveling to Canada? So here we are talking about an Australian citizen heading to Canada who is being interrogated by US Customs and Border Patrol about whether she might be pregnant. I've seen a report of a mother and daughter driving from Utah to a state in the Midwest for a lacrosse tournament. They were pulled over for going 5 miles over the speed limit. The daughter was interrogated for 10 minutes about why she was going to this tournament.
Why don't they just give her an ultrasound? I mean, they might as well just pull out the ultrasound machine and just see what's there. I mean, that is absolutely disgusting.
And that's why, like, people need to understand, and I think especially white people who are not used to being interrogated the way African American citizens and people of color are at the border or in certain neighborhoods, that you have a right to not answer questions from the police. And Molly can go into this a lot, but like literally you should say, am I under arrest? Am I in custody? If not, I'm not answering your questions, because the invasiveness here, they're trying to get information. They're not your friends. And like, we all need to shift our sort of philosophy and viewpoint in a world where the Attorney General of Indiana is trying to, publicly defame a doctor in his own state with zero evidence for performing a medically necessary abortion on a 10-year-old. And here she'd filed all the proper paperwork from the very beginning. But these are people who are trying to score political points, and they're going to use our bodies and our lives, our families, as, the sort of collateral to get there. And I think a lot of people don't understand that what's at risk, regardless of where you live.
It sounds essentially, and I think it's a police state. I mean, it is literally sounds like, something out of Man of the High Castle, not just Handmaid's Tale, of like, there's somebody watching you all the time. And, especially for women, it's just the burden of this. I mean, the stress, the burden, the trauma of that is just shocking. Yeah, Molly, do you want to jump in there? You're on mute, Mom.
Certainly the burden for women, and for the physical and emotional burden of forcing someone to remain pregnant, perhaps even someone who hasn't experienced any pregnancy symptoms yet because it's very early, to remain pregnant, for her body to change, and for her to be forced to bring into the world a person that maybe have severe physical anomalies or defects that she's not prepared financially or emotionally to care for, and that the physical toll that both pregnancy and childbirth take, and the after effects. Now, what I hope is that, as I said earlier, I hope people who previously never really considered this issue because it didn't have to do with them, to now understand that it does. I mean, I'm interested to see how this will impact, young men, college students, post-college 20-something, 30-somethings in their dating lives. So we're going to have women not only dropping out of the workforce, but out of college and high school. And so my hope is that their friends and family and dating partners and sex partners come to see the incredible harm that this is causing, and will respond at the ballot box in an overwhelming way.
I remember talking to a 16-year-old boy at the March for Life, and it was just wild because the March for Life is literally Catholic schools that are bussed in. I think the average age is probably 15. It is Catholic schools who are bussed in with a bunch of 14 and 15-year-old boys that have no idea what they're talking about. I remember talking to this boy and I was like, so I'm just wondering, like, if you were to get pregnant, like, would you, if you got to go pregnant, would you want her to keep? Yeah, definitely. Do you have a job? No. Have you finished high school? No. But I would get a job. Yeah, definitely. And you could see even in his eyes, it was like this, like, wait a second. And I think that's what's also really interesting about this. Like, I wonder what your perspective is on the women who protest outside abortion clinics and then they have abortions and then they're back on the picket line the next day.
I think there's been a sense for a long time of my abortion was justified, but you are having an abortion because you were irresponsible. And I think that also reflects, or that is now reflected in a shift in the dynamic where the language around abortion always seemed to be to blame the woman because you should have been more careful and you shouldn't have been using abortion as a form of birth control. But now we're going to see this is going to impact, this will impact even people who are very careful, and even people who are the victims of rape or incest, whose the fault for their pregnancy lies not with them, but with either an accident of nature, like condom breaking, or the man who chose to force himself on her. Yet she bears the consequences.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that's positive that we're seeing is people sharing their abortion stories. And there are incredible groups like We Testify, led by Renee Bracey Sherman, who've been doing this work for decades, getting women to publicly share women and pregnant persons, because it's important to acknowledge here that while the majority of people who get pregnant are women, there are people who don't identify as women who get pregnant, and they need abortion care as well. And erasing trans folks from this conversation is really harmful. So there are trans folks in Renee's organization and others who are sharing their stories. There are candidates who are sharing their stories. I have heard in the past month alone since Roe fell, abortion stories from 3 or 4 friends who I never knew had abortions. And the reality is, and you said this in the beginning, Sam, abortion is healthcare. We know that the data is 1 in 4 childbearing women will have an abortion at some point in their lifetime. We know that the majority of people who have abortions are already parents to children who they are often desperately struggling to raise. And they're making these difficult decisions in their families about what's best for them. And I think it's really critical that those who feel comfortable sharing their stories and are able to come forward and destigmatize abortion and show that it is regular, normal health care, and that everybody in this country, whether you know it or not, knows and loves somebody who's had an abortion. And I think that's the only way we're going to move past the demonization here. And it was that sort of sharing that I think really helped with LGBTQ rights movement and gay marriage, right? The stats changed so dramatically in such a short period of time because so many people realized they knew somebody who wanted to marry somebody who, they loved, and that was all that mattered. And so I do think that maybe the silver lining of this, although again, we're gonna, burden people and re-traumatize people who have already been traumatized and burdened to share private health information with the public or with others just to make a point. But I am very proud of everyone who stepped forward and is publicly sharing these stories to show people that you have no idea And you shouldn't have any idea of what's going on.
Circumstances. Another thing too that I think is important is that it doesn't have to be the extreme abortion story. Like I was going to die. Yes, that's important to know, but women should be able to access it regardless. Because if you do not want to be a parent, the state should not force you to be a parent, particularly a state that does not provide paid federal leave, that does not have universal health care, that does not give, I think the child tax credit is over now, right? Like that has not extended the child tax credit, where our school systems suck. I mean, it's our state is not ready for an influx of babies with parents who aren't ready to be parents. And we're also going to see, and this pisses me off too, people who say they're fiscally conservative but socially liberal. Well, I'm sorry, but having children when people can't afford them means that they end up on welfare. That means that people have to pay higher taxes. I just want to point this out. The Guttmacher Institute estimated that in 2010, the services provided at publicly funded family planning visits resulted in a net savings to the federal and state governments of $13.6 billion, or $7 saved for every public dollar. So if you want lower taxes, you should be arguing for abortion. 100,000,000%. There is no congruence between people who claim to be fiscal conservatives and saying that you are anti-abortion. I'm sorry, you cannot be both.
And we have to acknowledge that being pregnant is one of the most dangerous things you can do in America for a number of reasons. One, we have like the highest maternal mortality rate in the world for a developed nation.
Yeah, we're the only developed nation with a rising rate of maternal mortality.
Right. We wouldn't meet our own requirements for global public health assistance based on our shitty maternal mortality rate. And it is 4 times that for women of color in this country. And then, Sam, you talked about, safety and domestic violence early on. And we know that one of the most dangerous times for a woman in an abusive relationship is when she becomes pregnant, right? It is an issue of control and power. And we know that women, the most likely cause of death for a woman, under 60 in this country is intimate partner violence. She is murdered by someone she knows. And pregnancy is a major risk factor for that, particularly in situations of domestic violence. So what we are definitely going to see a spike in maternal deaths, in children being orphaned because of the laws that have gone into place. And we actually have a ton of data from overseas when policies like the global gag rule are in place, or in countries that greatly restrict access to abortion and other reproductive health care, you can just see unsafe abortions skyrocket and all sorts of other issues that lead to a spike in maternal deaths. And that's what we're looking at. And Molly, when you mentioned, people have been prosecuted in the US already for having a miscarriage and being suspected of self-induced abortion. Well, in El Salvador, where abortion is illegal, there are dozens of women serving life sentences in prisons for showing up at the hospital with, in sepsis, in shock, bleeding from miscarriages. And they are assumed to have self-aborted, and they are prosecuted, and they are locked up, and the key is thrown away.
So, and their sentence is actually worse than rape victims, is worse than rapists. The sentence for abortion, for having an abortion, is can be 30 years. For rapists, I think it's 3 to 6. I mean, so that means also rapists can hold it against people who get abortions and use it as kind of a blackmail tool. Well, don't tell them I raped you, because I'm going to tell them that you had an abortion. And that sentence is actually longer than mine. I think the other point that is really, important to make clear too, because we're talking about trauma, is victims of rape. And that being forced to bear a child that has the resemblance of your rapist is a double traumatization. I did my master's thesis on children born of wartime rape. And in Bosnia, where a lot of the women became pregnant by Serbs, not a single one of the women who became pregnant during the Bosnian War wanted to keep the baby. And there were reports of them throwing the babies off of bridges. They didn't want to remember the Serb soldier that raped them. Who wants to remember that? We also saw that women were ostracized, stigmatized, rejected. The kids were rejected. In Germany, oh yeah, this was really interesting. In Norway, when women were raped by German soldiers, the babies were seen as dangerous due to German blood and were institutionalized and called barbarians because their fathers had German blood. They were just put in prison. This is the issues for victims of rape is so horrendous. Plus incest, you end up with kids that have genetic disabilities because the gene pool is too small. So I'll stop there for a second.
Yeah, no, I mean, I talked about this on the campaign trail, but a lot of people don't necessarily know this, but I was raped when I was a sophomore in college, actually by a police officer who offered to walk me home to my car after being at a party. And I've talked about it on the campaign trail with regard to abortion rights, because the first thing I thought of was, oh my God, if I'm pregnant, I have to have an abortion. And, I was able to, I didn't have to make that choice. I wasn't pregnant. But to think about, like, that experience has stayed with me my entire life. If I had been pregnant and not been able to have an abortion, I wouldn't be sitting here today. I would probably be dead. I mean, the rates of suicide among rape victims are already so high. And so you're right, like the trauma that is compounded and the things that we will make people do, because even when there's a rape or incest exception in the law, they make you prove it, right? So it just the trauma that we are putting upon people. And then you have senators in the US Senate standing up and saying things like, well, I don't think abortion tourism is something that we should be promulgating, right? And
we're going to the
girl in Ohio who's a rape victim. That was the first time she got on a plane. I'm sure she had a lovely vacation in Indiana. Like, the disrespect and the dehumanization that these mostly older white male politicians in the US Congress show and in these state legislators show to women is so disrespectful. And I grew up in the church. I struggled with thinking about, like, could I have an abortion? And I came to the decision of absolutely. But that's the point, right? It is like your individual decision to make, and nobody should impose their religious beliefs or values upon anyone else. And it's just so dehumanizing. And that's why I'm so pro-choice, and why I've devoted my life to working on reproductive rights, is because women, mostly women, and anybody who can't access the health care they need are going to be fundamentally second-class citizens. They can't finish their college degree. They can't participate in the political sphere. They drop out of the workforce, like Molly said. We are literally making sure that half of our population is not giving their best to our country, are dehumanized and treated like not worthy, not equal. And it's just fundamentally wrong. And
fundamentally wrong. And it goes back to also GDP. We now have people who are not going to be able to contribute to our production. I do want to go back to the suicide thing. First of all, Steph, I want to thank you for sharing that on air. Really powerful story, and deeply, deeply upsetting and troubling. And so thank you for your vulnerability in sharing that. And I'm so sorry that happened to you, especially the betrayal of it being a police officer who's supposed to be there to protect you from would-be rapists, to be the perpetrator. And that's not the first story I've heard about sexual assault by police officers. It's so upsetting. But the concept of suicide, and if we look at the rest of the world, in El Salvador, one of the leading causes of maternal mortality is actually suicide. Half of the teen girls who commit suicide are pregnant, and it's the leading cause of death amongst teen girls. We're going to start seeing that. We're going to start seeing girls who, can't afford to get to another state. There's too far of a backup. There's too much shame. They're going to kill themselves. And that's going to affect not just the girls, but families, societies. I mean, when someone kills themselves, it's a trauma for their entire community. This is what we're going to see. Yeah. Molly, do you want to say something? You're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I wanted to add that the lingo has been pro-life. I don't know what's pro-life about that.
No, it's not pro-life. And Molly, can I ask you, you used the word, because I always went to anti-choice, but you used the word forced birthers. Can you explicate on that a little more?
Well, I think the term pro-choice has always been vague. Choice for it's been opposed on the other side by those claiming to be pro-life. So anti-choice, yes, it says you don't have a choice, but what this really is this is forced birth. This is forcing women, even little girls, to bear to term and give birth to a child that they may not be able to care for, be willing to care for, or that may itself be severely ill. And there's no other context, with the exception of perhaps in our society, with the exception of some police officers in some areas, where you have a duty to endanger your own life or even your health or safety to save another person. In fact, there is virtually never a duty to save another person, even if it poses no potential harm to you. And what these laws are doing is they're privileging what may be a clump of cells with or without an electrical current over a living, breathing person. Even if, as in the case of the 10-year-old, maybe that person is a child herself.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about how this is a life and death issue. What are we seeing in terms of women, this killing people or potentially having that effect?
So we just heard about a case in Wisconsin, which you mentioned, Samantha, has that 1849 trigger ban. And a woman was, basically had a miscarriage that didn't complete and was bleeding for over 10 days, lost multiple liters of blood because the hospital refused to perform a very simple 10-minute medical procedure that would have finished, extraction of the expelling of the fetus because they were worried about their legal liability. And I hope that we see more courage from providers. I am heartened in a number of the OBGYNs who I've seen step forward and say that they will provide critical life-saving care regardless of the personal cost to them. And it's hard to walk in the shoes of these providers who have families of their own and are terrified of the death threats that are coming at them. We've seen an increase in death threats to abortion providers, including that doctor in Indiana who her child was threatened with kidnapping. But that's the real problem here is that even when there's an exception for life of the mother, what's the life, as you raised earlier, versus health exception here, where that exception has been removed for a lot of people? You have to wait until somebody is so sick that they are on death's door to provide them with care that could have been given days earlier to avoid sepsis and the trauma that these folks are facing, all because of a fear of legal liability. And it goes absolutely against doctors sort of, do no harm to their patient oath. And I think that's why you're seeing the American Medical Association, ACOG, the Association of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the World Health Organization, all coming out and saying, abortion is healthcare. Abortion is life-saving healthcare. It's essential healthcare. And these decisions need to be made by doctors in the best interest of their patients. And when politicians step into that treatment room, that's when people die. And it's people probably already died. We're going to see those cases come forward or been near death. And we know that that's the case. And Molly, I don't know if you've seen, but the government is trying to pull together groups of volunteer lawyers to sort of help defend all of these providers that could be at risk and patients. And it's really, I think, critical that all of us who have a law degree do everything that we can to help protect the people on the front lines who are facing prosecution for just doing their jobs.
I'd like to I wanted to ask Molly about Arizona. Zach, can you bring up that first map of where abortion is banned and not banned? Is that up, Zach? I'm assuming yes. So with this map, it looks like Arizona, it's banned in Arizona, but it's not banned in Arizona. What the heck is going on in Arizona? Oh, you're on mute again, Molly.
Oh.
I got you.
This is one of the things that perhaps the Supreme Court didn't expect, or if they did, then they're incredibly cynical, which also wouldn't be surprising. But Arizona has a law dating back to the 1800s, from when it was a territory, before it was a state, that banned abortions. Now, Arizona is, while it has some very major cities are very blue, and it has trended blue in some recent federal elections, the state government is still very red, and in some cases very radical. And so we saw with the new justices on the Supreme Court the ascendancy of is radical right religious individuals, states starting to pass laws that clearly were in violation of Roe, but that perhaps weren't as bad as the old law. So the old law from the 1800s banned abortions completely, and then more recently, but before the Dobbs decision a few weeks ago, Arizona passed a ban on abortion after 15 weeks, and also a ban on abortion if your reason for seeking abortion is because the embryo or fetus suffers a genetic defect, including truly horrible defects and diseases that would cause incredible suffering.
Like Canavan.
Right, like Canavan disease. I don't know if your viewers are familiar with it, or Tay-Sachs disease, another
neurodegenerative leukodystrophies. Our sister suffered from Canavan disease, and no parent should be forced to have to take care of a multiply handicapped child. It is absolutely devastating while they watch for their child to die. It's horrible.
I mean, beyond that, there's also the choosing or being forced to bring someone into the world who will suffer. They have to undergo numerous painful surgeries, who in the case of Canavan disease and Tay-Sachs even more so, will never be able to walk or speak or feed themselves or in effect move. I think that's really many of our worst nightmares. I'm sure many of you know older people or parents or are such people who say, if as I get older, if I ever get into that state, I don't want to. And instead, we're going to be forced to give birth to children who would experience that for their entire lives. And to me, that's certainly not pro-life. That's really anti-mercy and pro-suffering. In terms of Arizona, so Arizona more recently passed this ban on abortion after 15 weeks and for reasons of genetic defect, understanding that the old law from the 1800s was enjoined, meaning could no longer be in effect after Roe. Now, the new laws are clashing with the old laws, because you say, well, what law controls? Is it this old law that was enjoined because of Roe that now comes back into effect, or the new laws that allow abortion up to a certain stage, although restricting it for certain reasons or after that in violation of Roe? So right now in Arizona, the landscape is unclear. The Attorney General has said that he thinks that the territorial ban is the controlling law. A federal court, meanwhile, has enjoined the more recent laws. But providers don't know what to do. Patients don't know what to do. So to my understanding, all abortion providers have ceased providing abortions in Arizona. And I've already read a few terrible stories of women who were suffering medical distress or were raped or in abusive relationships that didn't know how they were going to be able to obtain an abortion. And it's not just, even for women with means, it's not going to be so, when you're either having a life-threatening emergency or how are you going to get out of state in later stages of the pregnancy? not supposed to fly. You could be stuck in traffic, like, God forbid, if anyone's ever driven on the 10 west in rush hour going towards the west coast of California, potentially having a medical emergency. And beyond that, there are going to be huge waits.
And I'm already seeing we're already seeing that there's like not enough Plan B, there's not enough Ella, there's not enough because people are trying to stock up on these things. And that's concerning even in blue states. I've gone looking for Plan B sometimes and CVS has been out. And that was pre the overturn of Roe v. Wade. I think we're going to see supply chain issues as well, where it's going to be much harder to be able to abort early or even use the morning after pill. I want to talk a little bit about now what can we do? So what about opening up abortion clinics on federal land? Is this a real possibility? And what's the government's concern with going about this?
Go ahead, Molly.
I was going to let you speak to that.
Okay. Well, I was just going to say there are a lot of legal scholars who have thought a lot about this issue. Rachel Rebochet, who is the dean at Temple Law and an old friend of mine, has published on this. You may have seen her on Samantha Bee talking about it. It's something that everybody from Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to Senator Elizabeth Warren have been advocating for. The idea here is essentially that federal law trumps state law. So on federal lands, even in a state that restricts abortion, federal law would apply. So some folks have said, why not have the federal government lease land to abortion clinics, lease space on federal land in these states and provide these services? People have suggested that the Veterans Administration, where there are veterans clinics and healthcare services all over the country, could provide abortions. People have talked about setting up a floating abortion clinic in the Gulf of Mexico for folks down there because federal law controls in federal waters. The Biden administration and others have said, well, federal employees might not be subject to state law, but we're concerned that providers or patients, as soon as they left federal land, could be prosecuted criminally. I think, Sam, what a lot of us would like to see, those of us in the advocacy community, is to have an administration, to have a Congress that says, you know what, we're not sure if this is legal, but we're going to try it because people need abortion care right now.
So you mean do what the Republicans do?
Right, exactly. Like, okay, it might not survive a court challenge, but how many people could get an abortion in between when that challenge was filed and it was stopped? And, hearing from, I ran for office. I understand the stakes of the 2022 midterms, I think more than most people, but you cannot say to people, wait until November, vote in November. How many women need this care before November?
So what would that look like? Would it be an executive order? Like, I'm trying to understand what exactly would be issued that would reenact it.
Like Health and Humans, Molly, feel free to jump in, but like Health and Human Services, has already said you must do X, Y, and Z if you receive federal funding. Like you must provide abortions with the life of the mother. Why don't they say if you receive federal funding, you have to provide abortions for rape and incest victims, or you have to provide abortions up through X weeks of pregnancy? I mean, our fear as Democrats, and it's mostly Democrats, of rocking the boat and doing something illegal is really failing to meet the urgent moment that we find ourselves in. And this shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone. I mean, even if you had your head in the sand, they fucking leaked, excuse my language, the draft opinion in early May. So you had almost 2 months before it became law. And
so why didn't we have a plan? I mean, a plan in place to
well, the Biden administration on day one was presented with something called the Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights Blueprint that was drafted hundreds of pages long by the sexual and reproductive health and rights community. And they drafted that and shared it with everybody running for president in 2020. And so to say that people didn't know what to do, or I just think that this administration has had a lot of things on its plate. There's COVID, there's Afghanistan, there's inflation, and people have been in reactive mode. And that's Congress as well, right? It is on Congress that they have not codified Roe v. Wade in the past 50 years. And this was one of the first things that was traded away during the Affordable Care Act debates in 2008, right? Abortion was so controversial, having the federal government pay for abortion and the federal health plans was removed from the table. It was a huge fight to just get contraceptive coverage in there. So, people have been doing battle on this issue, but quite frankly, I think it comes down to having the people whose bodies who are on the line at the table. And the reality is that there are only 16 Democratic women senators out of 100. And in the House, we're talking about, no more than 24%. Until women and Democratic pro-choice women are elected in numbers that are pushing, half of the Democratic caucus or half of the seats at the table, these issues won't be prioritized, whether it's abortion, you talked about the child tax credit, paid family leave, universal pre-K, childcare. And we have just seen that the majority of male politicians do not prioritize these issues in the way that
it's not just they don't prioritize them. They just don't. It's not like they don't seem to care all that much.
They trade them away.
Well, why? Okay, I want to know Molly's opinion on that, but then I also want to get to why the LGBTQ, ruling sailed, and the other one didn't. But Molly, first, let's just go to you. What's your opinion on, should we say if you get federal funding, you have to provide abortions in cases of rape and incest, or at all? I mean, is that a possibility? What do you see there?
So I am in favor of taking all available measures, and absolutely the administration should do it. To the extent they have, they feel like it's uncertain legally whether it will be upheld, let's get caught trying. Now, in terms of legislation, and we all know the filibuster is an obstruction to virtually every Democratic priority. I question the wisdom of believing that we can simply codify Roe nationally and move on. I think it's extremely likely that this Supreme Court would rule that the federal government does not have the power to do that. That whether abortions should be legal or illegal or under what circumstances is a states' rights issue. And then we will be back to the place where we are now. So my personal belief, my strongest belief is that we are not going to be able to protect women and the other rights that we care about, that the Supreme Court is intent on eviscerating: gay rights, voting rights, the rights of Native Americans, the rights of public safety. We're not going to see those protected again or in the future unless we expand the Supreme Court. Now, the contrary talking point is, okay, we expand the Supreme Court when we have.
I just want to be very clear on what you just said, is that all of these populations, minority populations, and women who are not a minority, are going to continue losing rights unless we get more justice on the Supreme Court. Is that accurate?
I think you don't need a crystal ball to see that. And particularly, Stephanie talked about Justice Thomas's concurrence, which affirmatively stated that he wanted to reconsider whether people should have the right to use contraception or to have privacy in their sexual activities in their own homes, or to marry the person you love. I mean, these are, I think the right to privacy is really core to what we, in the Western world, and especially as Americans, consider to be freedom. I mean, we read about, China's, surveillance, incredible surveillance and intrusion of its citizens. And I really fear that we're heading there. And
there's some other hypocrisy that I just wanted to illustrate, is that, in the Virginia elections, there was this whole outcry about critical race theory and about how, parents were not allowed to make decisions of what goes on in schools and how their kids or what their kids are taught. But now we're saying parents do not have the right to choose whether or not to have children. I mean, that is like, this is about, and I think, I also want to frame this, like we talk about like the effect on women, like we were talking about before, like this is an effect on families. And it's also not respecting the family unit to make the decision that's best for them, not just the woman, but that for many people, it is a joint decision between the two parents. Of It's a very intimate moment. I've been there of saying, do you want to keep this? Do you not? What are the implications? Can we afford this? How we handle it? It's already a hard enough decision that's really just terrible, than to have to say, oh, well, never mind, not our choice. We have to listen to these, old male, Republicans in our state legislature that say that we have to. So, okay, I guess we're having a kid. I mean, like to take that away from the family unit feels like a betrayal of the family unit, which is something that I think our country was also founded on, was the sanctity of the family.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, we have to remember that this has never been about the sanctity of the family. This is about power, and it is about the power to impose a very majority of people who don't agree with it, right? We know from polling, depending on how the question is asked, anywhere from 65 to upwards of 80% of people are in favor of abortion, depending on how the question is asked. Gay marriage has, polling in the low 70s. And what we see here is a system that unfortunately the founding fathers designed to sort of counter majoritarian influence at a number of different steps and allow the opportunity for a small minority of people to, basically assert their Christo sort of white supremacist view of the world on people. And everybody laughed about this until the Roe decision, but the person I ran against in 2020 leads the House anti-abortion caucus. He's been in Congress for 42 years, and he has always advocated for banning access to birth control, banning abortion, full stop. He has led a number of bills attempting to revise the definition of rape because he wanted to narrow the exceptions for when abortion could be provided in instances of rape. He is also firmly against LGBTQ marriage and any sort of rights. And people think that this is the extreme, but this is actually the view of a number of people, and certainly a great number of people. Look at Ginny and Clarence Thomas, who currently wield the levers of power in the Republican Party. And so when they tell you in November, if we win, we, the Republican Party, we're not going to pass a federal abortion ban, they are lying to your faces. And I think it's really, I ran on this issue. All of my mailers were like, Chris Smith wants to ban abortion, full stop, even for rape victims. Chris Smith is coming for your birth control. And people thought that I was, overstating the case. June 24th, 2022 was the best day ever in Chris Smith's life, and the best day for many Republican officials who have worked solely to get to this point. And this was step one. And so since we're talking about what people can do, and we know that younger people and Democrats in particular tend to turn out less in off-year elections, i.e. non-presidential elections, what people need to do is register to vote and show up to vote this November, because abortion is literally on the ballot. Kansas is attempting to ban abortion through their constitution on a ballot measure. A number of other states are following. And if we can't hold the line and maintain Democratic control of the House and the Senate while President Biden has 2 more years in office, what we will see start to happen after the 2022 elections, and certainly in 2024, is an erosion of every other single right. And as Molly said, it's a court that we know is going to say, thank you so much for codifying protections for gay marriage, Congress. We don't care.
Too bad. Yeah, too bad.
It's not a right. And I think, if you take that global lens, right? I've lived in a bunch of democracies that were failing as a foreign service officer. We've looked at what's happened in Hungary and Poland and Brazil, and American democracy is on the brink. It's January 6th. It's the Dobbs decision. It's so much more. And I know most people, and we're probably preaching to the choir here, don't want politics to invade their everyday lives. They're concerned about feeding their kids and getting enough gas in the car to get to work and taking a vacation. And all of those things are going to become moot if we don't do enough to save our country and our democracy and our way of life from people who literally want to take us back to a time where women and people of color and non-property owners didn't have the right to vote, didn't have the right to own property, certainly didn't have the right to an abortion. And we're so close, and it's scary to think that this all hinges upon 10,000 votes in Wisconsin and 15,000 votes in Georgia. And those are the states that are most active. Today, a judge just said that Georgia's abortion law could go into effect that basically gives the fetus personhood. So it explicitly allows you to file for child support the minute you can prove pregnancy. It's crazy. And the ramifications from laws like that are just, as Molly said, it's going to be cascading.
And this all, is at the root of the church, even though America claims to have a separation of church and state. I mean, all of this is about religion, which is why, Molly, I actually wanted to ask you, how does this go against, what are the statutes, and I think my language is probably wrong, that this goes against? Freedom of religion, sex discrimination. Can you talk about some of those? Like if someone was to file a lawsuit, what's the bases that this is discriminatory?
So there are a lot of potential arguments to make against these. The Supreme Court has been very, very protective of religious liberty. And by religious liberty, I mean pretty much exclusively the liberty of Christians to discriminate or impose their will on others. The Roe decision itself.
The definition of freedom of religion. I kind of love that. That freedom of religion now means the ability for Christians to impose their religious views on other people, even if it hurts them.
Right. The separation of church and state is virtually no more after the Supreme Court decisions of this term. We were talking about the Affordable Care Act a little while ago, and when in one of the cases about the Affordable Care Act, the court pointed to the fact that religious institutions could opt out of providing contraceptive care. Then later on, those religious institutions challenged that because they didn't want to sign the piece of paper that says, "Hey, we are not going to provide coverage for abortion. You, federal government, need to pick up the tab," because writing that down to them was considered facilitating abortion and went against their religion. And the majority in Roe in 1973 recognized that when life begins is kind of an existential question that everyone has different views on. Different religions have different views on it. And they said, we can't say that the state has a right to choose for you or your religion, which theory of life is correct or is preferred. And what this decision does is this says, we are going to allow people who believe that the theory and that life begins at conception, and we are going to allow that to be privileged over the opinions of people of other faiths or no faith who may believe that it within their religion it's absolutely necessary or the religion requires having an abortion when it, say, endangers the life of the health of the mother, or when it's going to bring forth a child into this world who's going to experience extraordinary suffering or imminent death. So really, this is privileging one religion over another. Now that's not a statute. That's the First Amendment. There are also religious rights statutes, but this is really a core First Amendment concern that now in people whose religions and religious and moral and ethical beliefs would otherwise compel them to have an abortion, to now be forced to carry it out. based on the views of people of another religion.
Right, even though it goes against their religion.
Right.
Which is not religious freedom. It's anti-freedom.
I also have this theory. The Supreme Court is also very fond of the Second Amendment and expanding gun rights. And they did so for the first time in pretty much American history in a case called Heller in 2008, where they ruled that the Second Amendment means that you have a personal right to keep a firearm in your home for self-defense. They've since expanded that, including in the term that the Supreme Court term that just ended. But my feeling is that, where there are no life or health exceptions, including mental health, why are you not entitled to use force there to preserve, if it has an abortion, to preserve your own life or health? I mean, it's
the Second Amendment parallels are like mind-boggling, Molly, because when you think about like the number of restrictions pre-Roe falling that were deemed to be reasonable, a 24-hour or 48-hour waiting period, having to have an invasive, unnecessary ultrasound, parental consent, being forced to read false materials and watch false videos about risks to abortion, when abortion is actually one of the safest healthcare procedures that there could be. And then you think about the lack of barriers on the gun side, right? There's no waiting period. There's no parental consent. There's just, and we've seen it play out. Like, what if these young men who are committing mass murders had to go through any of the hoops that a young woman does to get an abortion? And
right. And then this is a weapon.
How do we live in a country that's like that?
Right, because of sexism, because people care about controlling women, because if it was all women buying guns, it'd be different. I mean, I think, frankly, we should not let men buy guns. I mean, it's always men who complete mass murder. It's always men. They're the ones who are, or there should be an assault weapons ban. I mean, there's so many things. And then also the irony is that, we could bring kids into this world and then have to be scared they're going to get killed in school. Like, I know, Molly and I are Jewish, and we've worried about, my niece being at a Jewish school because of so many hate crimes. I mean, we shouldn't have to worry about that. That's freaking horrendous because it's so easy to get guns.
If the foremost concern was for the lives of children, we would see that consistently. Instead, what we were seeing is, pure hypocrisy that favors one political and religious worldview. And that is scary in a country where we all, or at least we did, grow up learning that in public schools, actually, at least in the Northeast, that church and state are separate and that they should not intertwine.
So can I just want to move because we're running out of time. What can people do? I mean, we've talked about obviously voting in the midterms. We've talked about potentially putting pressure on the Biden administration to retract federal funding from places that won't provide abortion. We obviously, I mean, in terms of other things that I've been thinking about, like offering our own homes to sisters in prohibited states, donating airline miles to people traveling for abortion, volunteering for clinics. I mean, there's, putting pressure on employers to make public statements. What else do you feel like people can do who are really angry about this right now?
There are a bunch of abortion funds that currently exist. We don't need to recreate the wheel here. And so I think people, if you're looking to your state, your city, probably already has an abortion fund in existence. And if you donate money to them, they are providing assistance to those in need, whether it's providing them with housing or assistance in travel or childcare or anything else to get an abortion. I think we need people to get loud. One of the reasons that, and I'll say it here, the Republicans leaked this opinion in early May. It was a Republican clerk or justice, and they did it to dilute the moment. They wanted people to come out and protest in May and then protest in June. And then we're all so exhausted. It's the end of July that people are, sort of like we're grieving and we're tired, but we need to continue to get loud and keep the pressure up. And you need to call your representatives and you need to volunteer at the polls and vote. But we also need to provide as much support as we can publicly to the doctors and other providers who are facing legal action. So we talked about the government is putting together a list of volunteer lawyers and others to assist them. They have a website called reproductiverights.gov that is, full of information. There are a number of organizations doing this work that people can volunteer for or donate to. But I think there's also this need to keep loud and keep this issue in the forefront, because Republicans are hoping that we get tired and it goes away and that they can talk about inflation in November. And so show up at town halls and ask these people, what's your position on gay marriage? Do you think I have the right to get birth control? What's your stance on abortion? And make them go on the record. Be loud and as you can, and also take care of each other, because I think there's this real sense that self-care is needed right now. And so I need to tag out today after doing this show and not do anything for the next 48 hours on this issue. But I know that there's somebody else that's stepping up. And so we all need to do as much as we can, but take care of ourselves, because this is a marathon.
Yeah. Molly, anything to add to that?
Vote. And I would encourage people. I don't know if I don't recall if we got to talk about it. I was going to urge expansion of the Supreme Court as the only method of ensuring that the rights and freedoms that we treasure continue to be rights and freedoms, and that this becomes a democracy. So with that, vote and call and pressure your senators and your legislators to expand the Supreme Court and kill the filibuster to do it. That is worth killing the filibuster for.
All right, ladies, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been such a pleasure and a privilege, and I've learned a lot. Frankly, as a non-lawyer, I've been trying to keep up with this, and you both broken things down for me. You've broken things down for our audience. I hope that it's a lot clearer for people, the legal ramifications of this, how this is going to affect people, and what we can do. So I really want to thank you for your time, and also to acknowledge that, just like you're saying, Steph, you might not, want to take a break for 48 hours. This is deeply upsetting to a lot of people. And I was just running a workshop today on inclusion, and I usually refrain from talking about abortion rights in the corporate setting because it's not seen as something I should do. So I didn't say anything, but I said, what are the things that are happening right now that necessitate a new style of leadership? What's going on in the world? And it was, some of the usual stuff, Black Lives Matter, humanitarian crises, someone said, and then someone said the overturn of Roe v. Wade. In a corporate workshop with all of their company there. And they put that in the chat. Because that is something, when we think about inclusion, we think about leadership, this is not only deeply upsetting, it's harmful. It could affect the health, the futures, the trajectories. So many things of women that are working within any organization. And we can't just ignore it. And I would like to see, frankly, more companies come out and not just say, oh, we'll give you some money to go get an abortion, but to come out and say, this is wrong. To use their corporate power to push and say, this is anti-democracy, this is anti-human rights, this is, frankly, anti-capitalism. And I think we also need to push the boards of private companies to come forward and say that this cannot stand, or they will go invest all their money in China. I don't know what it takes, but I think that we also need to leverage the power and the money and the resources of the corporate sector, who have huge lobby shops. There are lots of people running around Capitol Hill to increase, bandwidth for the internet so that Facebook can have whatever. We need them to, I think, put their full weight behind this as well. So I was pleased to see a company in the private sector open that up today, because I think there's been a fear of talking about it because abortion has become so politicized. With that, I want to thank you both so much for coming on the show and for being such fierce advocates for women's rights. I know Molly was running around trying to get signatures for Arizona to put abortion on the ballot, which unfortunately it didn't. And Steph, I know you're advising political candidates on these issues. So thank you so much for the work that you do as activists and as feminist leaders. Oops, hold on one second. We've got you both muted. I can't unmute you, Steph. There you are.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. Give me hope.
And keep drawing attention to this issue, because as Stephanie said, we can't just get tired and let this go, because we're going to continue to see an erosion of our personal liberties and things that we care about in our day-to-day lives.
Thank you. Thank you so much, ladies. Have a great night. Well, that was Stephanie Schmidt, who is a former congressional candidate in the state of New Jersey and the head of foreign policy for the Center of Reproductive Rights. And Molly Ilana Carlin, you might notice her name is similar to mine, my older sister. Can you see how she inspired me? Who is a U.S. federal public defender and literally spends her days standing up for people that don't have the resources and who usually were wrongly prosecuted or put in jail for more than they were supposed to be. So the messages to take away from this: don't forget about this issue. Vote in the midterms, and not just vote in the midterms, but go to your local Democratic office and say, I want to volunteer. A lot of the presidential campaigns will get lots of volunteers, but the midterms, a lot of the state level candidates, there's not people pouring out of the woodwork to volunteer for them. So go volunteer. Say, what pro-choice candidate can I volunteer for? Donate to any and all abortion funds that you see. They are really, really trying so hard to do the work to get women access to the life-saving care that they need. Put pressure on your companies to make public statements about abortion and to say that this is wrong and to put their public weight behind this issue. And obviously to pay for abortion. Getting abstinence-only education abolished. We didn't even talk about that. The rates with the highest levels of teen pregnancy are the ones with abstinence-only education. Well, those are now a lot of the states that have a ban on abortion. So they have a ban on abortion. They have abstinence-only education. They're going to have a dramatic rise in teen pregnancy. That also needs to be abolished. And we need to look at sexual and reproductive education from an entirely different lens. Be open about your story. It matters to people. Brene Brown says that mutual vulnerability is the thickening agent of human connection. Be vulnerable about your story, unless you're in a state where you're getting an abortion right now and it is banned, and then do not tell your story. But if you did have one beforehand, please share your story. It helps enable other people to get the permission, and it destigmatizes abortion, which has become so stigmatized. And then further things, my company, Empower Global, we're going to be having a workshop on creating institutional change with a focus on reproductive rights. It is on August 10th at 6 p.m. Eastern time. If you Google Empower Global Creating Institutional Change, and we'll put it in the chat on YouTube, please come to our workshop. It's free, or you can donate, but come to our workshop. I'm going to be focusing specifically on looking at creating institutional change on abortion rights. This is a module that I teach within the Women's Leadership Challenge, which is a 15-module course for women to step into their power and create social change. And I have never offered this module for free before, but I am offering it because of the gravity of the moment. I'd also like to say that if you are interested in being a feminist leader like one of these amazing women, we do have 2 spots left for the next cohort of the Women's Leadership Challenge starting in late August. So if you want to be surrounded by other empowered women, it's a small group of 8 women. We talk about stuff like this. We have a space to talk about things that upset us. And we also have a space to really identify our values and who we are as feminist leaders, understand how to promote feminist leadership, build our own damn table, and create institutional change on the issues that we care about. Definitely apply. You can look up more information on www.womensleadershipchallenge.com. Lastly, I want to thank our sponsor, Zach. Whenever I say, hey, Zach, can you put that map up? Zach has been with me from pretty much from the very beginning of starting this show 2 years ago. Zach Ward at Stream Inspectors. And they are the lead producers of live stream production. There's a reason this show looks good and it's not a zoomy or grainy Zoom webinar that's really intolerable to watch. It's all because of Zach and his team. So if you're interested in live stream production and having a really high quality show or production, go to streaminspectors.com. And the last thing is, if you think this issue is important, if this scared the living bejesus out of you, share this episode, share it with your anti-choice friends, share it with your pro-choice friends, share it with everybody that you possibly know. This is an issue we need to keep talking about. We need to understand the implications of what is happening with the overturn of Roe. Share it on YouTube, share it on Spotify. Rate us as 5 stars on Spotify and Apple so that we go up in the algorithm so people are able to see this show. And please support our production costs. Good journalism doesn't just happen. We need your support. For less than the cost of a Starbucks per month, $3 a month, you can support this type of journalism. And that's on www.patreon.com/SamanthroPolitics, SamanthroPolitics.com. Patreon.com/SamanthroPolitics1. Please consider supporting us on Patreon. All right. I think I'm out of breath for tonight, but thank you so much for tuning in. Stay hopeful and let's mobilize for change because we cannot allow this to stand. Have a good night, everyone. This is Samantha Carlin saying good night. Bye-bye.